Namibia is flipping the script. The country is introducing new visa requirements for US and other Western allies.
New visa regulations requiring US citizens.
Africa, where the tiny African kingdom of Eswatini is pushing back, albeit cautiously, against US President Donald Trump's controversial third country deportation policy.
Big news out of Africa, and it's making waves all the way to Washington. Namibia has just sworn in its first ever female president, and she's not wasting any time making history. President Netumbo Nandi-Ndaitwah has delivered a bold message, one that's got Donald Trump and others in the US paying serious attention. For years, the US made it incredibly difficult for African citizens to get visas, dragging out the process, handing out rejections, and often showing a lack of basic respect. Meanwhile, Americans had it easy. They could hop on a plane and land in African countries with no visa, no hassle, and zero accountability. That VIP treatment? It's officially over. Namibia just flipped the script. Under President Nandi-Ndaitwah's leadership, the policy is simple and fair. If Africans need a visa to enter the US, then Americans will need a visa to enter Africa. No more one-sided rules, no more diplomatic double standards. And here's the twist. Trump didn't take this shift seriously at first, but now he's rattled. Before we dive deeper into what this means for US-Africa relations and how it might reshape global travel norms, go ahead and hit that like button and subscribe to our channel. You don't want to miss what's coming next. This week, over 500 American citizens were ordered to pack their bags and leave Namibia immediately. Why? They broke the country's brand new visa rules. No applications, no respect for the law. And Namibia, they're done playing tour guide to entitled travelers. But here's the real question. What exactly did these Americans do wrong? What sparked such a bold, sweeping move from Namibia's government? And what happens if these Americans refuse to leave? Could deportations be next? Let's break it all down. It's official. Namibia just flipped the script on US immigration policy. As of April 1st, 2025, Americans no longer get to stroll into the country without a visa. That old free pass? Gone. Namibia has made it crystal clear. If Africans need visas to enter the US, then Americans will now need visas to enter Africa. No more one-sided rules, no more special treatment. This isn't just policy. It's a historic stand led by Namibia's new and first female president, Netumbo Nandi-Ndaitwah. And make no mistake, this move isn't about revenge, it's about fairness. For years, Namibian travelers have been treated like second-class citizens when applying for US visas, stuck in endless queues, forced to go through degrading interviews, and often denied for vague or arbitrary reasons. Meanwhile, American tourists could fly in and out of Namibia with barely a question asked. Not anymore. Namibia is now requiring US citizens to get a visa on arrival, costing about $90, and that's just the beginning. Authorities have launched a full-scale crackdown targeting Americans living or working in the country without proper documentation. This isn't just about tourism. It's about sending a loud, clear message. Africa is done with the double standards. No more you need us, but we don't need you energy. Namibia is standing up, and the world is watching. As of April, over 500 American citizens in Namibia have been flagged and ordered to leave. But this isn't just about tourists overstaying their welcome. Many of them were deep in Namibia's lucrative mining sector, quietly extracting diamonds, uranium, copper, and rare earth metals without proper visas or work permits. They flew under the radar for years, but now that radar is locked in. Namibian immigration authorities have started handing out official deportation notices, and law enforcement is stepping in to make sure every order is carried out by the book, but without compromising Namibia's sovereignty. This is a new chapter, one where even Westerners can't hide behind their passports.
President Nandi-Ndaitwah couldn't have been clearer. This isn't about hostility, it's about fairness. If Namibians need to go through red tape to visit Washington, then Americans will need to do the same to come to Windhoek. Her message wasn't angry, it was dignified, measured, and powerful. And she didn't stop there. In a historic announcement that's shaking up global diplomacy, President Nandi Ndaitwah revealed something extraordinary. Namibia is going visa-free for all African nations. While Americans will now need to apply for entry, Africans will be welcomed freely. Why? Because Africa isn't the problem. Africa is the solution. This isn't just a visa policy shift. It's part of a bigger Pan-African vision, one that promotes unity, trade, and free movement across the continent. It's about turning Africa from a continent of borders and barriers into a connected home where African passports carry real power and no African is made to feel like a foreigner on African soil.
This is definitely a major change for us, or an additional change as we've had already a couple other borders opened already.
Around the world, reactions are sharply divided. Across Africa, Pan-African voices and everyday citizens are cheering Namibia on, calling it a long overdue stand for fairness and mutual respect. But in places like Washington and parts of Europe, there's a quiet panic brewing behind closed doors. Because here's the question no one in the West wants to ask out loud. If Namibia can pull this off, who's next? Namibia's bold move is more than a visa policy shift. It's a declaration, and it's sparking a bigger conversation. Is this the start of Africa rewriting the rules of global diplomacy? Will more African nations finally start demanding the respect they've always deserved? Or will this ignite backlash and economic pressure from countries long used to calling the shots?
Whatever happens next, one thing is clear. Africa is done asking. It's drawing lines, and Namibia is leading the charge. But why start with the US? Simple, because enough is enough. For decades, African travelers, especially Namibians, have faced outrageous hurdles just to visit the US. A Namibian entrepreneur applying for a visa, they'll face background checks, piles of paperwork, proof of financial worth, and still have nearly a 50% chance of rejection. Not because of a crime, but because of where they were born. Families have been blocked from attending weddings, funerals, conferences, even from seeking life-saving medical treatment, while American tourists flew into Africa visa-free, no questions asked, like the old colonial era never really ended. So Namibia drew the line and chose to make an example. And the United States was the perfect example. Why? Because no country has gained more from Africa while giving back so little. U.S. corporations have run diamond and uranium mines in Namibia for decades. They've dominated agriculture, tech, and telecom sectors. American citizens live comfortably in Windhoek's upscale neighborhoods or run safari businesses in Etosha, many without proper visas or work permits. Meanwhile, Namibians can't even get an appointment at the U.S. Embassy in Pretoria, let alone a stamp of approval to visit. This wasn't just an inconvenience, it was a slap in the face. When President Netumbo Nandi-Ndaitwah took office as Namibia's first female president, she didn't waste a second. She made one thing crystal clear. Namibia is done being the playground for unequal diplomacy. Her administration launched a full review of the country's visa policies, and what they uncovered was stunning. Americans had far more access to Namibia than Namibians had to the US or any Western country. And it gets worse. Many of those Americans weren't even following the rules. The 500 Americans ordered to leave Namibia weren't just tourists who overstayed a stamp. Some never had visas to begin with. They slipped in under an outdated visa-free loophole and took advantage of years of weak enforcement by past governments. And they weren't just lounging around either. Some were working illegally. Others were extracting resources, diamonds, uranium, rare earth metals, without proper licenses. A few were even engaged in unregulated missionary work, operating outside local laws with zero accountability.
Now, here's the part that really raised eyebrows. When Namibia gave these individuals a chance to apply retroactively for proper visas, they were rejected, not as punishment, but because they simply didn't meet the country's legal standards. That's when President Nandi Ndaitwah stepped in and authorized full deportation proceedings. The message? Loud and clear. If you wouldn't allow our people to do this in your country, don't expect to do it in ours. Embassies scrambled, lobbyists panicked, US officials called for leniency, but Namibia didn't blink. This wasn't personal. This was about principle, about dignity.
Namibia's action wasn't about targeting Americans or picking a fight. It was about calling out hypocrisy.
The United States enforces its immigration laws without hesitation, and deportations happen every day. But when Namibia holds Americans to the same standards, suddenly it's controversial? That's the double standard Namibia just blew up. And here's where it hits even harder. Most African nations hesitate to push back on the West, afraid of economic threats, diplomatic isolation, or even subtle retaliation. Namibia didn't flinch. It didn't cave. It didn't apologize. It didn't explain. President Nandin-Datwa simply reminded the world reciprocity isn't revenge. It's respect. If Americans need visas to visit countries like Russia, China, or Brazil, why should Africa, the most exploited continent in modern history, roll out the red carpet without a second thought?
Namibia's move wasn't emotional, it was strategic. It sent a shockwave through diplomatic circles, from embassies to corporate boardrooms, letting everyone know the old days are over. Africa is no longer your free ride. It's not your unchecked safari zone, and it's definitely not your open gate unless you're ready to open yours too. America just became the first to feel what that really means. The moment Namibia made its move, the West panicked. Embassies in Windhoek became active with urgent memos. He was fighting for sovereignty, the kind Africa was denied for over a century under colonialism and now under diplomatic hypocrisy. And if the West thought they could scare Namibia into retreating, they clearly didn't know who they were dealing with. Namibian officials reminded the world that every nation has the right to enforce its own borders, something the US does daily with full aggression. And yet, when Namibia did the same, the West called it hostile. That contradiction is the very heart of this policy change. Why is it acceptable for the United States to detain African students at airports, delay visas for months, and fingerprint applicants in embassies, while Americans walk through African borders with no questions asked? Namibia had an answer: no more.
And that answer didn't just shake the US, it shook Europe too. Germany, a former colonial ruler of Namibia, reportedly reached out to assess whether the visa policy could extend to EU citizens. They were told, reciprocity is our foreign policy. If Germany's citizens enjoy open access here, Namibians expect the same in Berlin. Now that Trump's been publicly embarrassed, the question on everyone's mind is this: how will the US strike back? The headlines out of Windhoek said it all. Namibia to deport 500 Americans. US nationals ordered to leave. Reciprocity demanded. But beyond those headlines, something deeper and far more uncomfortable hit Washington hard. For the first time ever, an African nation wasn't asking the United States for anything. It was telling. And that shift? It rattled the US foreign policy establishment. Behind closed doors, State Department officials are scrambling. Losing a few tourists? Not a big deal. Diplomatic tension? They've managed that before. But the symbolism, that's the real threat. Because Namibia just did something unheard of. It made Americans stand in line like everyone else. No special treatment, no privileged pass. And now Washington is asking the question it dreads: what if other African nations follow? For the US, this isn't just a diplomatic snub, it's a crack in the global status quo. And when that kind of power structure is challenged, retaliation usually follows. Because here's the uncomfortable truth. When a smaller country dares to say no to the US, especially on something as symbolic as visas, the response is rarely public, but it's always calculated. You'll hear calm diplomatic language in press briefings, smiles in public, but behind the scenes, the moves are quiet, targeted, and deliberate. And Namibia knows this, but it's not backing down. Let's talk real strategy. One of Washington's quickest pressure points is economic aid. Namibia receives millions in U.S. support every year through programs like USAID and PEPFAR, the President's Emergency Plan for AIDS Relief. These aren't just donations. They fund clinics, scholarships, agriculture, and entire public health systems. If tensions rise, the U.S. could suddenly reassess the relationship. A fancy way of saying, you stepped out of line, now here's your punishment. And yes, Trump has already hinted at cutting USAID to countries that don't toe the line.
So Namibia saw this coming, they knew the risks, and they still moved forward. But not all retaliation comes with headlines. Some of it comes in silence. Suddenly, planned meetings vanish from calendars. Embassy staff are quietly reduced. Namibian diplomats applying for U.S. visas? They're stuck in bureaucratic limbo, buried in vague administrative reviews that drag on forever. Subtle, strategic, silent. These kinds of tactics don't make global headlines, but they send a loud message behind the scenes. If you challenge U.S. dominance, your leaders get left waiting outside the room. And the U.S. has more than one play in its pressure playbook. If diplomacy doesn't work, trade might be the next target. Namibia currently enjoys preferential access to U.S. markets through the African Growth and Opportunity Act, better known as AGOA. It's supposed to help boost African exports. But if tensions escalate, that deal could be the first thing on the chopping block.
How? The U.S. could threaten to suspend Namibia's AGOA benefits, using vague claims like non-cooperation or barriers to American businesses. And it wouldn't stop there. Washington could start making quiet calls to its institutional allies, the European Union, the World Bank, the International Monetary Fund. Loans could get delayed. Infrastructure projects might suddenly stall. Investment deals could disappear. Even U.S.-linked corporations doing business in Namibia could be encouraged to quietly back out or hit pause. But here's the twist. Every one of those moves only proves Namibia's point. Because if a nation is punished just for demanding equal treatment, what does that say about the values the West claims to stand for? It's not about fairness. It's about obedience. And now, that message is echoing across the African continent, louder than ever.
But here's where it could seriously backfire. Africa is not the same continent it was 20 years ago. Today, many nations are looking east toward China, Russia, BRICS, and new African-led alliances built on mutual respect, not submission. If the U.S. pushes too hard, it won't just lose Namibia, it could lose Africa. And that would be a shift the West isn't ready for. Other countries like Nigeria, Ghana, South Africa, and Kenya are watching this play out closely. If Namibia can stand strong through any U.S. pushback and come out unshaken, you better believe others will follow. They'll demand visa reciprocity too, and start rewriting the rules on how Africa deals with the West. Sure, the U.S. might fight back. It could cut aid, slow down visas, tighten trade, and use global institutions as pressure tools. But here's the catch. In doing all that, it might spark exactly what it fears most: a whole continent refusing to beg, bow, or wait for permission any longer. Because if one small country can say enough is enough and survive, what happens when the entire continent joins in? That kind of backlash? Washington might not be ready for it. And Namibia knows this. So will the U.S. retaliate? Maybe. But Africa has faced retaliations before. Coups, sanctions, threats, you name it. What it hasn't seen enough of until now is real unity, and Namibia just sparked that fire. What do you think about Namibia's new visa policy for Western countries? Drop your thoughts in the comments, especially how you think Trump will react knowing 500 Americans got deported from an African country. Want to see more videos like this? Hit subscribe and tap the bell icon so you don't miss a thing. Thanks for watching. Stay tuned for the next update.